All right, kids. Welcome to Bedtime Stories with PB&J. Today we're going to read about a really big picnic. You like picnics? All right. Jesus had finished teaching. Everyone was hungry. Send them away to buy food, his disciples said. But Jesus wanted to show the people that they could trust God. Why don't you feed them? Jesus asked. It would take a year's wages to buy bread for them all, his disciples cried. How much food do you have? Asked Jesus. That wasn't a question to you. There's a boy here. Hey, wait. There's a boy here, said Andrew, who has 5 loaves of bread and 2 little fish. Jesus smiled. Perfect. Tell the people to sit down on the grass because they're going to have a picnic. So the people sat down all over the mountainside. Jesus thanked God for the bread and the fish. Then he broke them into pieces for his disciples to hand out. Jesus' disciples passed out the bread and fish to the whole crowd. There were 5,000 men and lots of women and children too. Everyone ate as much as they wanted. That's more than we have in our family. And we got a big family. Afterwards, the disciples gathered up the leftovers. There were 12 baskets full, from just 5 loaves and 2 fish. The people knew they could trust God to care for them. All right, what do you think this story is about? What can we learn from this story?
About God can provide food even with 5 pieces of chips and 2 hamburgers.
Chips and hamburgers. This is bread and fish.
Oh,
We're having fish sandwiches. Nolan, what did you learn?
They gave away food.
They gave away food. Gracie, what do you think this story's about? Giving away food? Yeah. All right. Let's find out what this story's all about.
What is this story about?
We're going to talk about it right now.
What is this story about? Answer the question.
It's about more than giving away food. Oh, thank you very much. Hey everybody, welcome to Lunch with PB&J. Glad you guys are back with us today and ready for another bedtime story. I was gonna say Bible story, which it is, but it's a bedtime story.
Yes.
How you doing, Joy?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing
You caught me
well.
off guard.
I'm sorry. Not really. I like to do it, get it spontaneous, get things flowing the right way.
How are you guys? Everybody good?
Go ahead, comment. Let us know how you're doing, how you enjoyed our first bedtime story, David and Goliath. Heard
Yeah.
from a couple of you. That is.
Did you see David and Goliath in a different light, in a different way?
That's what we'd like to know. We would like to know
Yeah.
these things.
Yeah.
If you saw David and Goliath in a new way, because I think we did in a lot of things as well. So, but we are excited to jump back into a new bedtime story today. One of my personal favorites, Joy.
Drum roll.
This is the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, which in and of itself is a very misleading title.
Yeah.
Because it was more than 5,000.
A lot more
Quick
people.
fact for you. Also, fun fact for you, when it comes to this story, I was telling Joy this the other day after we had decided to do this one, is when I started in ministry, started in full-time ministry. I was traveling actually with my parents doing evangelistic ministry, and we would work with 40, 50, 60 people from local churches as we traveled. And on Saturday mornings, we would have a little devotion with them before we started the day. And so I was starting out. I knew I was called to ministry, and I was traveling with my parents at the time, kind of helping them out with some stuff, and just an opportunity to be in ministry. And my dad came to me one day and he said, okay, next week you're going to do the devotion. And I said, okay.
Panic.
And so I started studying and praying and I pulled out my Bible. This is my Bible from when I first started in ministry. I don't know if I bookmarked it or not. I didn't. But this story was the very first devotion I ever shared. You're not going to be able to see it, but it's all underlined in there, right there. And I remember I had Post-it notes all down this side of the page. And it was only supposed to be like a little 10, 15-minute devotion at most. And so I was up, man. I was up late. I was going over it, had it in my brain. I was trying to, like, I'm not going to look at notes and all this stuff, and I'm just going to do it. And what was supposed to be 10 to 15 minutes, I think I was done in roughly 2 minutes. The idea of me not reading notes turned into me reading all of my bullet point notes that I'd put inside my Bible. And I walked away from
how
it.
he's changed over the years.
Yeah, can you imagine that? People from Connect?
I can guarantee you're
2
going
minute
to
message.
be longer than 2 minutes today.
But what was cool about that, and this is something that I always share this story with people that I'm kind of working with that are starting out in ministry, and everybody's always nervous to get up and speak in front of people, and I always share this story because I walked away from that feeling completely defeated and almost borderline humiliated. Like I thought, man, I've got this. This is no problem at all. And a couple nights later, we were in this prayer time before one of the crusades, and people were sharing testimonies. And I remember one of these people spoke up and they said, I came on Saturday. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to be here or not. And, I really thought about not getting involved and not doing it. Didn't feel like I could do anything. And then I remembered Ben's devotion. And then Ben got up on Saturday morning and shared this devotion of Jesus feeding 5,000 people with this little boy's lunch. And it was about, just bringing what you have. That was kind of the point of the story that I shared. And it completely changed this person's perspective. And they were just saying, that they never would have gotten involved if it wasn't for that story. And I just walked away from that going, wow, even in my own failure, what I viewed as a failure, God used as a tool to really
I think it's cool
inspire
too
somebody.
the first time you're sharing a devotion, and sometimes those are the things here, you're sharing a devotion about something of, okay, Jesus used this little boy's, bread and few fish, and then you feel like, oh, I was so inadequate.
Yeah.
And God teaches you the same lesson, so that's kind of cool.
So, yeah, this one has some personal meaning to me, so I'm excited about this one. But we what's interesting about this story, we're going to just dive right in, all right? I had leftovers today for lunch, by the way. I ate your soup.
So did I.
It's delicious. All right. Anyway, that was our lunch. Now that lunch is out of the way. So what's interesting, too, about this story is it's one of the miracles. So not every miracle is talked about in all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But this particular story is found in all four Gospels. Yeah. So you can find it in Matthew, Mark. So it's in Matthew 14, Mark chapter 6, Luke chapter 9, and John chapter 6. All right? So you can find it all there. And if you're a part of our church, all right, and I know a lot of people that listen are a part of our church here in Bolton, Connect Church, you've heard me use this illustration or explain the Gospels this way so many times. But in case you're a new listener, I'm going to explain it to you this way. Sometimes when people read the Bible, especially if you're getting into it for the first time, and you read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you start to discover that, man, these four books are really repetitive. They just keep talking about the same thing. But when they talk about the same thing, it seems like they're telling different details. And so some people have used that as an argument over the years to say that the Bible is inaccurate, that the stories aren't true, that they're embellished, whatever, and really use it to point out mainly inaccuracies in the Bible. But the way I always explain it is you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the four Gospels or four stories that really detail out. They're the accounts of Jesus' ministry while he was on earth. And they're all written by four different guys, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All right? And these four guys all had very different lives. They had different interactions. And so I always explain it this way. It would be very similar to you and three of your friends going to watch a movie. And then after the movie, I sit down with the four of you and go, hey, tell me about the movie.
Right.
Now, depending on what you're into and what you're paying attention to, you're probably going to tell me different ideas or different things that were important, that you think are important for me to know about the movie to really understand the storyline. It could be like talking to our kids. If you ask Isaac about a movie, you're probably going to hear all the action scenes and maybe some of the one-liners, right? If you talk to Kyla, you're going to get the whole movie. Like, every detail of the movie. You're going to get it all, okay? Yeah. And then probably some. If it's an hour-and-a-half movie, it's probably going to take her a couple hours to tell you about it, all right? If you ask Judah, it's probably going to be the funny parts.
Yeah.
You know, so it just depends on who you talk to.
If it was mine, I'd be like, I don't know. I wasn't paying attention.
I wasn't paying any attention. I was reading. So it just depends. And so that's what the Gospels are all about. It's the story of Jesus told from four different points of view, from four very different people. And so you get different perspectives. In Matthew, you really see, he presents Jesus as the king. Mm-hmm. He is the king of the Jews, right? In Mark, he is a servant. In Luke, he focuses on the humanity of Jesus, fully God, yet fully man. John sees him as the Son of God. Mm-hmm. And emphasizes that. In Matthew, he's writing to Jews. Mm-hmm. In Mark, he's writing mainly to Gentiles and Romans. Mm-hmm. In Luke, he's speaking to the Greeks. In John, he's speaking to us. Yeah. He's speaking to believers.
So, I think that's a good point, too, because it makes sense of who your audience is. Yeah. You know, you talk a little bit different, so.
Absolutely. And so it's really interesting, I think it's really interesting to read through the four Gospels. So with all that said, today.
Just want to add one point, though, is what's really cool is as you read these stories and you kind of like compare them, so to speak, what's the awesome thing is they don't contradict each other. No. They enhance each other.
They give, and I really encourage you to look through. So a few years ago, I bought a Bible. It's called a Chronological Bible. Yeah. That's what I read out of a lot when I'm doing devotions. And the reason for that is it takes the whole Bible and puts it into chronological order. Yeah. In case you couldn't figure out what a chronological Bible was. And so what's neat about that is with the Gospels is it takes stories like this that are found in all four and it puts them together so you can read back to back to back Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
It's really cool.
And you get this really clear picture as all these details are brought in. Yeah. And again, it's like walking up to, you know, I wanted to be a cop when I was growing up. So it'd be like walking up to the scene of a crime and asking four witnesses, what did you see? Right. And you get this really detailed picture of what was going on based on their perceptions of everything.
Their eyewitness of it, yeah.
Yeah, so cool. it's really neat to see. Today we're going to focus mainly on the Gospel of John, and it's my it was the one I preached out of, so maybe that's it. You know, 25 years ago, whatever that was. So maybe that's the reason I'm focusing in on that.
Are you trying to reprove something today?
This is redemption, people.
45 minutes later.
I'm going to stretch 2 minutes into 2 episodes. That's what I'm going to do today, okay? So yeah, we're going to focus mainly on John, but we will reference, I think both of us are going to reference back to a couple of the other Gospels as we go. And as I said, this was one that it's one of the miracles that Jesus does that's talked about in all 4 Gospels. Mm-hmm. And so I think it goes to prove just how important this particular miracle was, which begs the question, why did Jesus do miracles to begin with?
Right. Before we started here, I was telling Ben, I just wrote down this question of why did Jesus do miracles? And so for me, what I'm learning as I learn to study and how my mind works, a lot of times I'll ask questions as I'm going, and it just kind of it fills in those empty spots of why did this happen? Who was this person? What was the background? So for me, I asked the question kind of before I got started of why did Jesus do miracles? What was the purpose of that? I mean, they're really cool. They're awesome. But the heart of it, why did Jesus do miracles? And what's interesting, so he's going to start in Matthew, but if you look at John, the chapter before where we're going to be reading, so it would be John 5:36. Jesus has this encounter with some Jewish leaders. And he kind of lays out, he's laying out that basically he's the Son of God. And it's one of the few times where Jesus just blatantly says to the Jewish leaders who he is. And so in John 5:36, it says, so he's talking about John the Baptist is a witness, but he says, I have a greater witness than John, my teachings and my miracles. The Father gave me these works to accomplish, and they prove that he sent me. So I really found that interesting, the fact that he says, you know, a witness to who he is his teachings and his miracles. And just the fact that he's saying God, his Father, has given him these works to do, to accomplish and prove that, hey, it's God that sent me.
Yeah.
So in me asking that question of why did Jesus do miracles? Why did you see healings? Why did he raise people from the dead? Why did he do this miracle here that we're about to talk about? Again, they're really cool. It's awesome, but it was more than just feeding people.
Right.
The purpose was to prove, for Jesus to prove, and not for his benefit, but for our benefit. Another word for miracle is sign.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool. So Jesus uses miracles, and even today, he uses miracles to show who he is, to show that he is the Son of God.
Sure.
So that kind of just helped me in entering the story of, God, what are you doing? Jesus, what are you doing here? And we'll learn more of, you know, the details of it, but I thought that kind of set the stage of why he did miracles.
Especially for this story.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things I want to talk about in the beginning before we even jump over to John. So
Yeah.
I want to jump into the story. And as Joy said, I'm actually going to start in Matthew because the introduction to this story is very different going in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're very similar. But then John is really the most different of all the four Gospels, I believe. And because he really does, John really focuses in on Jesus. I always tell people, if you really want to know about Jesus, the character of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, really start in the Gospel of John, because he has a tendency to just kind of skip over all the fluff. Not that the other ones are full of fluff, not at all. So I don't take it that way.
Yeah.
But where the other ones are really trying to present, kind of almost explain, and I don't know, it's hard to describe.
I feel like you get a revelation of who Jesus is in John.
Yeah, and so he does. He kind of cuts out some details that you're like, man, why did he cut that out?
Yeah.
But it's because he just wants to focus on Jesus.
Yeah.
That's probably the better
Yeah.
way to say it, is he just wants to focus on Jesus. And so I'm going to start in Matthew, though, because I want to bring out a couple of points that really set up the miracle that Jesus is going to do. So Matthew chapter 14. And it starts at verse 13. It says, as soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. So, again, Joy said she kind of read the verse just before it goes into the story in John. The news, though, you don't really see it. You don't really get a full picture of what the news is that Jesus has just heard. And this is why the chronological is really interesting. It's very good. And also why it's good to read it in all the Gospels. So there's there's a major piece of news. So what's happened is all the disciples have just come back from doing ministry, right?
Yeah.
They've just come back from doing ministry. They're giving a report to Jesus of all the great things that have happened, but included in that report is a very, very important piece of information, and that is the fact that John the Baptist has just been killed. And John the Baptist, if you don't know the story of how John the Baptist was killed, it was basically some shifty stuff going on behind the scenes, and Herod's daughter asks for John the Baptist's head on a platter as a birthday gift. That's a little dark, but it actually came from her mother, and a whole thing there. You can go back and read the story.
Fascinating, yeah.
But I mean, he wasn't just killed; he was executed. He
Right.
was murdered, and so this is the news.
And he was being held in prison.
And he was being held in prison. This brings an end to John the Baptist's story, obviously. And so this is a piece of the news that Jesus has just heard. All right. So it says that he hears the news and he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. As you can imagine, hearing that John the Baptist, just not only a family member.
I was going to say they're related. What was it, cousins, or is it
So
where we didn't know?
We're going to go down a rabbit hole if we go down here, all right?
Let's say they're cousins.
They're basically cousins, okay? The way the genealogy is talked about and the way things were done there is different than the way it is
Maybe
now.
second cousins.
So they're related.
Yeah.
Just their family, okay? So a family member has died, and on top of that, it's been a huge ministry season.
Yeah.
All right? It's been a big season of ministry, and so Jesus goes to be alone. Goes on, though, and says, "But the crowds heard where he was headed and followed on foot from many towns. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick." I also want to show in Mark, I'm just going to jump over to Mark for a second, Mark chapter 6, verse 34, it says basically the same thing. They left by boat for a quiet place where they could be alone. Many people recognized them, saw them leaving. People from many towns ran ahead along the shore, got there ahead of them. And then it says, Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat. And again, it says, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. So it's only in Matthew and Mark that it says that when Jesus saw the crowd, he had compassion on them.
Right.
Now, if you're familiar with this story at all, Jesus in a moment is going to feed all these people miraculously. And so it's really easy, and I've heard people take this story and focus in on the compassion aspect of it, but tie the compassion to the feeding of the 5,000. But yet when you read this in Matthew and Mark, it doesn't say anything about the compassion being tied to the food. All right? So it's not just about providing physical food. Matthew says that when he saw them, he had compassion and began to heal their sick.
Yeah.
And then in Mark, it says that he had compassion when he saw the crowd because they were like sheep without a shepherd. They had nobody leading them. All right. That's what that means. They had nobody leading them. There was no spiritual protection over them. Jesus was always moved with, everywhere that you see Jesus showing any kind of compassion, it had to do with their spiritual need.
Yeah.
The spiritual need always came first.
Right.
As Joy said, the miracles were always about pointing to who he was.
And it's not that the physical was not, needed and amazing and God worked through that. But I think that point of it was first having compassion on their spiritual state.
Yeah. And so it is. It's that idea that, and I think we get lost in this now, today. We can get very lost in the idea that compassion as Christians, compassion as a church is only about, there's people that would say it's about social justice. There's people that say it's only, if we've got to be feeding the poor. And those are all things that the Bible says that we should do as Christians. But we can't ever lose sight of the fact that first and foremost, our responsibility as Christians is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. God cares more. This might sound very controversial to some. It shouldn't, but this is because this is the truth. God cares more about your soul, more about your spiritual needs than he does your physical needs. All right? And that's a fact. It's not that God doesn't care about you and what you're going through here and now, but he cares much more about your spiritual need than he does your physical need.
Yeah.
And that's, I think when I read this is always a point that stands out to me in this story, especially that line in Mark where he has compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd.
Yeah.
And so he began doing what? He began teaching them many things. It doesn't say they were like sheep without a shepherd, didn't know where to get food, so he fed them. That's not how he showed compassion. He showed compassion by teaching them many things. Right?
I think for me too, when I hear you say that and I listen to that, it's the thing of understanding that Jesus sees everything. Sometimes when we look with our physical eyes, we only see physical.
Yeah.
But what Jesus is, when he steps out of this boat and it says that he's filled with compassion, to me, it's him seeing their spiritual state. And, he's seeing their physical state, but he knows their physical state's temporary. He's looking at their spiritual state.
Yeah.
That's eternal.
Absolutely.
And so to me, again, like sometimes we just get only on the physical. And that's not at all to say that God doesn't want us to feed the hungry and clothe the poor and all these things, because I think they work hand in hand.
Absolutely.
But I think what you have to see here is what Jesus was seeing, something that other people didn't see. He was seeing the spiritual. When he says they're like sheep without a shepherd, he's seeing their lostness. Is that a word?
Sure.
He's seeing their spiritual state.
Absolutely.
Not just like you said, their hunger.
Yeah. And so I think it's a really important point to see is the compassion of Jesus in this story, but what it led him to do.
Yeah.
And the other aspect that I saw when I read this week, especially when you see the compassion side tied in, when I read it in Matthew and Mark, is this idea that, again, he's just got this devastating news. And he's gone to be by himself. Him and the disciples have gone to get alone to kind of recoup. Again, it's been a long ministry season. So they've been traveling. They've been going around. They've been doing a lot of things and seeing great things. But it's draining.
Yeah.
It's really draining.
Can you imagine how it would feel to get news that somebody you love is dead, gone? And it's not like Jesus didn't already know that. He knows all things, but he was his family member. He was his friend. I mean, obviously we know how Jesus felt about John the Baptist. And I think sometimes we look at it and say, well, it's Jesus. He didn't have feelings. No, he had feelings. He had emotion.
Absolutely.
Just like we do.
Yeah. And when you read it in Mark and Luke as well, you see that he wasn't by himself. He had his disciples with him, because this was a blow. This was a blow to the ministry.
Right.
I remember John the Baptist is the guy that started. He paved the way for Jesus.
Right.
Jesus said that he was the greatest prophet that ever lived. So you can imagine that
Heaviness.
when Jesus is sharing with his new disciples about the message of God and how all this is going and where it started and how it's progressed and the plans of God, you can bet John the Baptist was a topic in all of that, of just how crucial he was to what God was doing. And so this is not just a blow to Jesus, it's a blow to everybody. And John the Baptist was executed for talking about Jesus and preaching repentance, all the things that they were doing, right? And so you can imagine, like, these guys are all still pretty new to ministry, going, oh dang, like is this what's in store for us too? So you can imagine all this that's going on, and so they're like, Jesus, like, you know what, guys, let's go get by ourselves, let's go find a quiet place and get alone. And then as they get there, there's this crowd of people that's waiting for them.
Huge crowd
of people there. And there's probably something in the disciples that's just going, you know what? Jesus probably just going to tell them to wait till tomorrow. We're going to go get some rest. But instead, Jesus steps out of the boat, has compassion on their spiritual state, and immediately starts healing the sick and teaching great things, teaching many things to all these people. And if you can imagine the disciples in the background going, oh, come on, I'm tired. I want to get alone. And I saw this in a lesson. Again, I saw a lesson in this that sometimes when we go through hard things in life, we want to just shut down. And what can happen, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Again, there's many times where Jesus pulls away to get alone and kind of recharge and get with the Father and pray. Here, he was taking his disciples to do all of those things. But at the same time, Jesus saw a need and he responded to the need.
Right.
And I think we have to be cautious sometimes as Christians that we don't let our own busyness and our own tired, like, we don't let these things creep in. I think it's also one of the reasons that, the Bible says that we are to be filled to overflowing.
Yes.
And I heard a friend of mine say one time, as Christians, we need to be so full of Jesus and so full of the Holy Spirit that at the moment a need arises, we can give, even though we've been giving of ourselves, even though we've been talking, even though we've been there to be that shoulder to cry on or whatever. We're operating out of the overflow and not just
something empty,
not just out as an empty vessel, because we have to be ready to respond at all times. Right. And I just want to encourage you, like, I know that there's times where maybe you're feeling depleted.
Yeah.
and maybe a name pops into your head or somebody calls you or something, and you're like, oh man, that's 30 minutes of my life I'm not going to get back right there. And so you're tempted to just kind of ignore it.
Yeah.
Just understand that sometimes the thing that will fill us up the most is doing what God has called us to do. And those things, even though sometimes it can feel draining in the moment, you'd be amazed at how much that fills you up afterwards.
Because let's say that, you know, they did not reach out to this certain crowd in this moment. Like, look what it did for the disciples long term.
Yeah.
And look at how much they grew in their relationship with God and how much they learned, and we'll see later too what it does for them. But it's this thing, like, it was for them too. It's not just for the crowd. So that's the amazing part to me about even just ministry in general, is a lot of times we think, well, I'm going to pour out to somebody, and you know, there's moments where we maybe feel tired and there's moments where we feel rejuvenated, but regardless is when we act in compassion, when God moves us to act in compassion, like, it's going to be for our benefit also.
Yeah. And let me say, you might have just heard us both say the word ministry right there and think we're talking from pastor's point of views. I'm talking like as a Christian, understand our purpose as Christians is to tell people about Jesus.
Yes.
It is to make, as I've been saying at our church last few weeks, it is to make the name of Jesus famous.
Right.
And so anything you do to promote and to share the message of Jesus, that's ministry.
Right.
And we're all called to that.
Right.
And so what you see here is, and remember, these disciples, man, these were a bunch of roughnecks. A lot of the disciples, man, they were just kind of rough around the edges. And so the time that Jesus spent with them, as much as it was about teaching them about the things of God, it was also living out an example before them. Like, we look at the disciples and go, oh man, they were radical. They were on fire for God. And they were just, I don't think they always were though. Like, these guys are new to ministry. They're new to this whole following Jesus thing. And so Jesus modeled behavior for them. And I think it's important for us to understand that in this, I think it's an important part of this story, that they were burned out.
Yeah.
They were burned out. They were empty. They were dealing with loss in their own personal lives. And then all these people show up with need.
Yeah, because in one
the
of the
immediate
Gospels,
need is not hunger. Understand that too. We're going to read that in John.
Yeah.
The physical need came way at the end of the day. In the beginning, the reason Jesus started with these people was spiritual need. And then later on, he met the physical need.
Right.
And so it's showing the disciple, I think what Jesus is doing here is he's modeling that behavior of, hey guys, I know you're tired, but there's a need here. These people need us right here, right now.
Yeah.
There is a need that we need to speak to.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. And then I want to show this in Matthew 2, and then we're going to jump to John. In verse 15, it says, that evening, so now they've been here all day. That evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves. But Jesus said, that's not necessary. You feed them. So I'll be honest with you, this is a point that I've never thought of before in this story. New revelation for me.
Cool.
All right.
Bring it.
Here's the new revelation for me. We see the crowds following Jesus. They're getting ahead of him. They're coming to him. They've heard that he's healing the sick, all this stuff. They bring the sick to him. He's healing. He's doing all those things. It is not the crowd that starts to murmur and complain and say, we're hungry. Do something for us. It's not the crowd that's looking at their watch going, man, it's getting late. Maybe you could, hey, Jesus, could you wrap this up so we could leave?
Yeah.
It's the disciples.
Yeah.
The ones that already had a close relationship with Jesus.
Right.
It was the disciples that came to him and said, hey, Jesus,
Yeah.
you're going a little long, man. Maybe you could wrap this up. And they use the other, because they're like, hey, all these people, they need to go get something to eat. You need to think about them.
Yeah.
Jesus was meeting a need, the most important need. He was meeting the spiritual need. And I think sometimes as Christians, we can get so caught up in the church of what we think the world wants that we miss the real need.
Yeah.
We can get so caught up with, hey, we need to meet those physical needs. Hey, we need to cut the services shorter because people coming into church, they won't want to sit here for 2 hours. So maybe we need to cut down on the time, when in reality, people that are coming and finding Jesus for the first time, they will sit there all day because they're being
hungry.
fed
Yeah.
something they've never been fed before.
Yeah.
They're learning things they've never learned before. And oftentimes it's the Christians that are like, hey, we need to cut this out. We need to cut this out. We need to cut this down. We need to stop doing that. We need to go.
Yeah.
Let's just go. Let's just forget this. This is old.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think we need to be cautious as Christians, as people who already have Jesus.
Yeah.
We need to be cautious about stopping what the Holy Spirit is doing sometimes.
Yeah.
And I saw that in the story this time. It's kind of blew my mind of it wasn't the crowd that said, hey, we're tired and we want to go.
Because they could have just gone.
They could have just left. There's nothing keeping them there.
Right.
They could have just left. They weren't leaving. That was the point.
Right.
They weren't leaving, but the disciples wanted to leave.
Right.
So it's like the disciples, if you could imagine in today's day and age, it's like the disciples over there in the corner flipping the light switch on and off. Have you ever been in a church like that? I've been in churches like that.
Oh my gosh.
Where there's somebody flipping the lights on and off.
Or doing
basically
this
telling
with their
everybody
watch,
to go,
like
going around, shutting everything off. And meanwhile, there's people that are building relationships.
Yes.
And I've said it before, I'll say it again right now. Church isn't about us as Christians.
Right.
It is about bringing people in to meet Jesus. And how can we serve them? And how can we be there for them and make sure that they are learning and receiving the same things that we have received and learned about Jesus? How can we make sure that there is there's an atmosphere for them to do that as well?
Right.
And that's our responsibility as Christians in church, is we're bringing people into the presence of God. And we all have a part in that. And no matter how tired you are sometimes, no matter how much you've heard something sometimes, no matter how many times you've heard that pastor tell that joke, you laugh anyway, dang it. All right? It's still funny to them. So that was just something that jumped out at me as well.
That's good.
So, all right. Now we get to John, and we're going to dive in.
You can't leave
sorry,
yet.
Go.
Because I was the same as him, where I saw things in Matthew that I didn't see in John that were just like, wow. So in verse 15, it says, that evening disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowd away so they can go to the village and buy food for themselves. And it says, but Jesus said, that isn't necessary. You feed them. So I get really stuck on this word necessary, And I felt like even maybe last week you kind of just were explaining the word necessary in a sermon, but it's just this idea of must. The word necessary is must. And so it's like Jesus is telling them it's not necessary to send them to the town to buy food. It's not necessary. And so it's this thing of what's the opposite in that? Unnecessary, And so I got to thinking, is this thing of how many times in our life do we choose the unnecessary things and we miss out on the miracle? Yeah. And so to me, I think in this thing of the unnecessary things, a lot of times are these logical things, because the disciples is coming to them here are like, hey, this is a remote place. These people are hungry. Let's send them away to buy bread. And so it's this logical thinking that they're stuck in. Mm-hmm. And I just think a lot of times we become the same way, where we think logically, we think practical, and it's not necessary. Mm-hmm. It's not necessary to think this way, because it puts God in a box. Yeah. And so I just think, like, how many times again are we choosing the unnecessary method or means when we could be choosing something different, which is the miracle, basically. So I just kind of apply that to my own life, and I wrote this down. Stop thinking possible when God wants to do the impossible.
That's good.
And so it's for me in my life, I will sit and think, okay, God, you got to work this out and you're going to do it in this way. And when I think it through in my head logically, it's all these possible ways. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But how many times in you and I just looking back on our life in ministry, in marriage, in having kids, in interacting with people, in moving from this place to another, in buying a house and selling a house, all these things where God did impossible things. Yeah. So I just think it's really important. Again, that word stood out to me. Jesus said, that's not necessary. Mm-hmm. You feed them. And then it brings out the other phrase there, you feed them.
Yeah.
Jesus wants to do the miracle through us. Like he wants us to be involved in the miracle. So, that just kind of stood out to me, that word necessary. And just to kind of step back from the way I see God moving in my life and say, God, what are the ways you want to move in my life? How do you want to use me? How do you want to work through me? And stop thinking about it in the sense of what's possible and let him do the impossible in my life. Yeah. So that part stood out to me.
Oh, that's great. I love that. Hey guys, so we're going to call an end to week number 1 in our story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. We covered a lot of the background and the context leading up to it. Next week, we're going to jump into the actual Gospel of John account.
Yeah, he went longer than 10 minutes. That's 2 minutes.
She's doing next week all by herself. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. Again, if you want to contact us, you can do that through direct message, through our social media on Facebook, Instagram. Leave a comment, leave a rating, subscribe to the channel. Joy never likes when I say leave the rating, but it helps to make the podcast pop up in more places. But you can also share the link with your family, friends. We'd love to have them join us for lunch as well. So that's it for this week, guys. Join us next week for part 2 of Jesus feeding the 5,000, where we actually going to get to some food. We're going to get some food to lunch with PB, and I can't say it. Now I got to say it again. We're actually going to get to some food on lunch with PB&J.
Fish and chips.